Hello again, my name is Devin Knight. Welcome back to my series on working with the Microsoft Graph API inside of Power Automate. We are continuing on in our series. This is the third part of our series where we're now going to be circling back into Power Automate to actually show a real use case of how you might use the Graph API inside of Power Automate. Before we do that, of course, I want to remind you, if you haven't already, make sure you take a moment and subscribe. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you're notified whenever we have new videos that are dropped on our channel. And then, of course, if you do like this video, hit the like button as well, so that'll tell me that, hey, we need to do more videos like this. So, in our example that we're going to be tackling today, we're going to be looking specifically at an example of how we can handle when we have new users that we want to add to our tenant, to our Active Directory tenant. And this is something that we can use inside of the Graph API to be able to, one, check and see if a user is already part of our tenant, and if they're not, we can then add them to our tenant. Now, in our previous video, actually a video from quite some time ago now, we actually created an example of using the Graph API very briefly. And this is actually what that example looked like. We had a manual trigger that we just passed in an email address, and then we used that email address inside of the action, the HTTP action. We should have named this a little better as we come back to it later so we can recognize it. But what we're doing with this action is we are passing in that email address into the Graph API, and then we're returning back some more information about it. So we're returning back like the ID. We could get more information, but really all we're trying to do right now is just return back simply the ID column. You can actually see it's specifically telling it which column we want, and all we want to return back is just the simple ID column here. All right, now we're going to continue to use this example. However, we are going to change our trigger that's being used because I want to make this a little bit more of a real life use case that may come up where maybe perhaps you have someone that is joining your organization, or maybe perhaps you have the need to be able to add guest users to your tenant. I actually had this use case with inside of Pragmatic Works where I needed to add guest users into our tenant, and Power Automate was a perfect way of doing it in combination with the Graph API. So what I'm going to be doing is using a Microsoft form as a intake form here where we can add in a guest user. We're going to need them to plug in their email address and their first and last name, and that's all we need. And once they plug in that information, we will be able to add them into our tenant as a guest. So that way we can easily be able to have them sign into our Microsoft Teams tenant, for example. So to be able to use this Microsoft form as our trigger to know when to kick off our flow, we're going to need to go back to our flow and edit it and change the trigger to no longer be a manual trigger, but instead to be based off of Microsoft Forms. So I'm going to go ahead and delete our manual trigger here. And we're going to replace this manual trigger with one from Microsoft Forms. So you can find Microsoft Forms right here. And we want to pull in and say when a new response is submitted, that's when we want to initiate and kick off this flow. So I'm going to say when a new response is submitted. It'll take a moment. It's going to create a connector into Microsoft Forms if you don't have one already. All right, looks like it's done. And I should be able to find, I really only have this one form as part of this tenant. This is just a demo tenant for our YouTube video here. But I can select that I want to use the form called Add a Guest User Intake Form. That's going to be the form that we want to use to pull in the information. Now, this is simply the trigger. What we want to do next is add in a second action that actually gets the details of that response that's entered into our form. So we're going to add in another action here. So we'll add an action. And this is going to come from Microsoft Forms again. And we're going to get the response details. So what are the details that were entered in whenever that response was entered into our form? So we're going to select Get Response Details. We'll tell it which form it is that we're trying to monitor. It's going to be the Add a Guest User Intake form again. And then the response ID that we want to return back in each execution of our flow is going to come from our trigger. So we're going to use a little bit of dynamic content here. I'll take myself off screen here for a moment so we can see this. But we're going to use the dynamic content found over here on the right-hand side, and we're going to select the response ID that's coming from our trigger. You can actually see the name of the trigger right here. That's telling you that you're actually pulling the response ID from that trigger, and we're going to pass it into the next action so we can get the details of that response. All right, now that we've done that, we're going to go into our HTML, our HTTP action, the one that's here next, and we're going to have to plug in our email address now from the new action that we just added as opposed to the manual one that we had a moment ago. You'll notice that the manual one that I had there a few moments ago is no longer there because we deleted the manual trigger. And so once we deleted the manual trigger, it also removed any dynamic content that we had here. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in from our form the email address field right here, not the responder's email. That would be useful if we were actually having this as an internal form, meaning people filling it that are already part of our tenant, but we're actually going to have potentially people filling this out that aren't familiar with us. Maybe they're just guest users. So we're going to use this form, this field that we added right here. This is what we want to use to be able to check to see if they are already users in our tenant. All right, so we're going to go ahead and plug in the email address, check your spelling before submitting, because we want to make sure they type their email address in correctly, otherwise that can cause problems. And this is going to return back the ID that's used for that login. If the login doesn't exist, it's going to bring back a blank value. If it does exist, it's going to bring back a GUID of the ID that's associated with that email address. Okay, the same ID that you're seeing here is the same ID that we saw in the Graph Explorer in our previous video. So when we used the Graph Explorer, it returned back an ID for the user, it returned back an ID for the team, it returned back an ID for the team's channel, and those IDs are associated here that you can pass into the Graph API. All right, so this is looking good. We have this set up now where it's going to be able to check an email if they're already a user based on their email address. Now, if you didn't catch our previous video, much of what you see on my screen right now in this HTTP action was done in the first video on this series, so you may want to review that. We did walk through how to set up the Graph API and the app permissions, so you may want to check that out if you haven't already. All right, but I'm assuming that you've already watched that video, and so because of that, what I want to do next is I want to say, okay, well, if we were able to find that user, so let's assume that that user was actually already existing within inside of our tenant, then I don't need to do anything. They're already added. However, if the user was not in our tenant already, then I want that user to be added. So I want to add the user, and then I want to actually determine whether or not whether or not we're going to have to create the user. Okay, so we have a couple steps that we need to do here to be able to manage this. All right, so to do this, we're going to actually use a new action here called Parse Json. And what the Parse Json action will allow you to do is it will allow you to check out and basically create fields and break down the response from a JSON query into individual fields. So if I were to add in another action here, let me show you why this is necessary. If I were to add in something like a compose, like so, and then I say, hey, go ahead and return back something from my HTTP connector or the action above, you'll notice that I don't have individual fields that are being returned back. It's just bringing back either the body or the header or a status code meaning whether or not it was successful. So I'm not really getting the proper details returned back. So what I need to do is I need to do a little bit of parsing of the JSON. So I'm going to delete that action, and we're going to bring in a new action called Parse JSON. Not JSON, JSON. There we go. And we're going to go ahead and select that we want to parse JSON. And then the content that we're going to parse here is going to be based on the body. All right. Now, for the schema piece here, what I suggest you do is actually run the flow without the parse JSON and even use maybe perhaps that compose I had a moment ago. And you can generate a sample of the JSON schema that you'll need here based on actually running an instance of the flow. I happen to have the schema already necessary here. So you can see here, I'm happy to kind of plug this into the description of the video if you'd like, but you can see that I have the schema used to be able to extract out the ID column already taken care of here. So I'm just going to plug that in. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to start to look at the individual values that we want to return back. So I want to return back and see what are the ID columns. I want to break this down and return back the ID column from this parse JSON query so that way I can actually use it later on. So we're going to be able to try and pull all these different elements together so that way we can have the information that we need as we get deeper and deeper into this flow. All right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to now add in a condition, and the purpose of the condition is going to be to check to see whether or not the user that the email address for the user that we're attempting to add, we want to see if they already exist in our tenant, because if they already exist in our tenant, we don't want to try and add them a second time. So if we want to attempt to do that, we're going to go to add in a new step, and we're going to use a condition. Let's type a little bit more of it there. There we go, condition. And we'll select the condition. And then we're going to have to define what makes up how the condition is split. So we can determine that, hey, if let's say, for example, that we return back a blank, then if we return back a blank whenever we search for a particular user, that tells us that the user does not exist and we want to add them. So we would go down the left path. If they do already exist, then we don't need to add them and we can send them down the right path. That's kind of the idea of what we're trying to do here. All right, so if we want to build in some kind of an expression to check to see whether or not a value is blank or our data coming from our source is blank, what we can do is we can go into the choose a value section and we can build a little expression. So we can go into the expression section here, and we can type in the length function. The length function is a common method for being able to check for blank values or null values here. And we're going to say, hey, we want to check for the length of the value column from our parse JSON query, or our parse JSON action right above. So we're going to go ahead and select the value column, and you can see it's going to pass in the value column or field into our length property. And again, the purpose of what this is doing is if the value comes back where we have a value that is 0, if it's 0, then that tells us that it is blank or null, and we want to send it down the left path. If it's anything other than 0, if it's anything like 20 characters long, then we know that the email address already exists inside of our tenant, and we're going to send it down the right path. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. All right, so that's going to create this little expression here. One little tip for you that I like to do, so it's a little easier for me to figure out what these things are doing later. I like to copy these expressions and actually put them in the notes. I haven't been doing a very good job of documenting our work here so far. Like you can notice here, I didn't rename these properly like I should have to give them better context. But I do like to take the expression values when we start to do things that are a little bit more complex and put them into the notes section so I can see them a little easier. All right, but we're going to say if the length of the value from our parse JSON is 0, that would mean that it's null. It's blank. There's nothing there. So if it's 0, then I want to send it down the left path. If it's not 0, then it's going to go down the right path. So in the left path, what we're going to do is we're going to add in another HTTP action. So I'm going to go ahead and add an action here. And this is going to be an HTTP action. So I'll go ahead and add that in here, HTTP. All right, this is going to be a standard HTTP action like we did a moment ago. And in this new action, I'm going to be a better boy here, and I'm going to rename these properly here. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this, and I'm going to call this HTTP add guest user. All right, and I'm going to go back up to the top one here, and I'm going to rename this one, and I'm going to call this check for user, or how about this? Check if user exists by email. Okay? All right. So if the user does not exist, we're going to send them down this left path, and we're going to add them as a new user, again, using the Graph API. Similar to how we use the Graph API up here, we're going to use a slightly different call within the Graph API, but it will still allow us to be able to interact with it. Now this time, rather than actually pulling back information, we're going to post information to the Graph API. So I'm going to switch the method here. Instead of saying a get like we did in our previous one, we're going to do a post. And so using the post example, this will allow us to use things like invite users. So if we wanted to invite users, let me show you this documentation here. Again, I'll put this in the chat for you. But if we wanted to invite users to our tenant, even as guest users, we could follow some of the HTTPS request here and be able to make requests to be able to add in new users. So there's some examples of how to use this one here. You're welcome to kind of take a peek at the documentation. I'll put this into the chat or into the description of today's video. But what we're going to do is we're going to make the call to the URI is going to be to the invitations reference within inside of the Microsoft Graph API. And then I'm going to also reference for the content type. We're going to go ahead and put the header is going to be content type, and it's going to be JSON. So I'll pass in that information here as well. Oop, let me not do that. And then what we're going to do a little bit lower is we're going to add in some information that we had in our previous action up top here, like how are we going to log in, what are the authentication, what tenant is it that we're using. So we can hit the show advanced options here and tell it how are we authenticating. We're going to authenticate using Active Directory OData. And then we're going to copy in some of the same information that we had in our earlier action right here. And I'm going to grab the tenant. So I'm just doing a little copying and pasting here. I'm going to grab the audience. Oh, this is really going to be the same. I'll grab the client ID, and I will grab the secret. All right. Again, all of these will be scrubbed by the time this video is released, so no harm in me showing this to you in plain text here. All right, but what we want to do is we want to invite our user based on the email address and the name that they provided us, and we're going to be able to do that by passing into the body section here a sample of JSON code that will allow us to write back information into our Active Directory. So I have a little bit of information here. This actually comes from the documentation that I had on the screen a few moments ago. I have where we're going to pass in, or what kind of information we're going to pass in. So we're going to pass in the username. I'm sorry, the display name. That would be like their first and last name. We're then going to pass in their email address, and then we are going to send them an invitation that they need to accept to add themselves as a guest user. And then once they accept that guest user capability, it's going to have an option where I can redirect them to a specific URL. So if I wanted to redirect them to like a specific team site, I could do that. We can play around with that a little bit if we wanted to. I'm going to leave that blank for now, but just note that you could add in some different elements in there. Maybe you want them to go to a specific URL. Maybe I want them to go to my Pragmatic Works website. Whatever you want to do as far as where you want to send them after they sign up, you can come into the invited redirect or invite redirect URL, and that's going to redirect them to a specific website, in this case, pragmaticworks.com, whenever they accept the invite email that's sent their way. All right. But the next piece that we want to do here is we want to pass in, let me take myself off screen so we can see this a little better. We want to pass in the first and last name of our user, which we're going to get from the Microsoft form. So I'm going to go over to the dynamic content section here and pass in the first space. Let me get the space in here. Space, last name. That's going to be the display name of my user. And then where it says invited user email address, we're again going to get that from dynamic content from our get response action from our form. So I'm going to pass in the email address here. All right, so it's looking pretty good. So we're now able to add in guest users into our tenant. So let's go ahead and save this. And while that's saving, I'm going to go over to my admin tenant here. My Office 365 admin options here. And I'm going to go look at my users. And we're going to look to see here, I do have some users that are already part of this tenant. This is just a sample tenant. But I'm going to go look under guest users. And you'll notice at the moment, I don't have any guest users. But my hope is once someone fills out this form, they will be added as a guest user automatically using my form and then my flow afterwards. All right, so let's see this in action. I'm going to go ahead and hit test on our flow. So I'll test this out. It's going to go into test mode here. And then we're going to actually fill out that Microsoft form. So let's go ahead and go over to my form here. And I'm going to plug in my personal email address. I don't care if you see this. You can email me to my personal email if you'd like. And then I'm going to go ahead and plug in my name. And then hit submit. Now, what I'm expecting will happen, so it submits the form. I'm expecting that it's going to kick off the flow, and it does. It's going to check to see if my email address already exists inside of the tenant, and then it should parse the JSON. So the idea of the parsing of the JSON is it's going to separate out the results from that HTTP action into separate fields. And then we're going to see that our condition determined that our user does not already exist in our tenant, so it returned back true. And so it sent them down the left path where it added me as a user. So you can see it took the information from the form that we filled out, and it should have sent an email to me. And I can pop it open here. I'll move it aside here. But it should have sent me an email that I can now go check with an invitation to my tenant. So let me go ahead and bring that over here. And I'm going to go check my personal email. And I should have a new email that has landed in my inbox right here. So this is the email that I was sent. This is an invitation, and it went to my junk folder, so I'm going to move it out of my junk folder so it'll display a little better. All right, let's open it one more time now that it's out of my junk folder. But this is the invitation that was sent to me to be added to my organization as a guest user. I'll go ahead and accept that, and then it's going to redirect me right here. After I hit accept, it's going to redirect me to the URL redirect that we provided earlier, which, if you remember, we'll give it a moment or two here, that URL redirect was pragmaticworks.com. So now what I should be able to do is if I go back over to my guest user list here, right now you'll notice my guest user list is blank, but if I hit refresh, Boom, there I am. So I've now been able to add myself, my guest user, my Outlook.com email address even, as a guest user within inside of this Contoso tenant that I have set up. Now, remember, we did build in some logic into our flow to ensure that if the same user attempts to add themselves again, they won't be able to do it. So let's see what would happen if I ran this flow again. We could either run it in test mode, or what we can actually do is we can tell it to rerun this flow using the same values that we had in our previous example. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it to run this again using the same results we did a moment ago. And let's see what happens this time. All right, so it's going to be running based on the form that we submitted previously. It checked to pull back the user ID. Now it should find a user ID this time right here. Boom, right there. There it is, because it exists this time. It didn't exist last time, but now it does. So now whenever it gets its way to my condition evaluates as false because the account already exists, and it does not run the path on the left because the user already exists. So because the user already exists, there's no need to add them a second time. So what we were able to show in this example is how we can have a intake form for guest users that we want to add to our tenant. They fill out the Microsoft form. Once they fill it out, they are then automatically added into our tenant as a guest user. And then what we're eventually going to do in our next video is to show how we can take that guest user and then add them to a private channel within inside of Microsoft Teams. So that's our next step. That's going to be using a little bit more of the Graph API, but this first one was all about how to add guest users using the Microsoft Graph API, and we were able to do that here. Hope you liked this video today. Again, as a reminder, we have many people that watch our videos that have not subscribed, so if that's you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button as well as the notification bell, so that way you know whenever we have new videos that are dropped, and you'll be able to see those right away. And then hit that smash that like button as well if you liked today's video. Tell me to make more like this. That gives me a good indication if you're liking what you're seeing here and that we should keep going with it. All right, hope you liked everything today, and we'll see you in our next video in this series where we actually show how you can add these newly added guest users into a Microsoft Teams private channel. All right, we'll see you then. Thanks.